They're uneven, and be careful, the steps are uneven. And here is very low. The wall is low, have to bend our head.
For our first stop at Cyprus AD, I'm going to reach back into BC. This place that we're at is actually the burial site of the 7 Maccabee brothers who were martyred around 174 BC during the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Their mother was Aya Soleimani, and that's the name of the place. She's a Jewish woman who became a saint. I don't know how a Jewish woman became a saint after the death of her sons. It was thought that the space was possibly a synagogue in Roman times. The point is that this Christian catacomb actually predates Christ, and that's very interesting all by itself. The practice appears to have been much older than simply Christianity. Another curious but related fact is that on Cyprus at least, very frequently Christian pilgrims, as well as Muslim and perhaps other religions as well, including Jewish in this particular case, tend to visit the same sacred sites. That is, if a site is sacred in one religion, frequently the other religions will honor it as well. Of course, That's not universally true. There is also a curious separate sacred well, which is accessed by a separate flight of stairs, with water so clear you can actually step in it unintentionally, even though you've been warned. There's also a potentially hazardous danger because there's a deep well at the bottom there. It's possible that this sacred site actually goes back before the time of the Maccabees. It could very well be a pagan shrine of some kind. We're going over to Salamis now on the east side of the island. As a matter of fact, Salamis has almost always been the #1 city in ancient times on the island of Cyprus on the east side. In Ptolemaic times, it was in fact the capital, and it's only less than 100 miles off of the coast of Syria, making it an easy trip for anyone during ancient times. You'll recall that Salamis became the #1 city after the time of Elisha, when Elisha went sort of bankrupt. It had been founded by the brother of Ajax, and it developed into the major city on this particular part of the island, and eventually it's destroyed for all practical purposes in the Arab raids of the 7th and 8th century, and it's eventually followed by Famagusta, which is just a little bit down the coast. But we're looking at the Roman period, and in the Roman period, Salamis is the #2 city, and Paphos is the capital. Salamis is to be the island's #1 archaeological site. This particular site is absolutely huge, and another city, of course, was not built upon it, and so the ruins are fairly easy to get to and fairly extensive. This is the gymnasium, followed by the baths. This part of the city still has a few mosaics and frescoes, but for the most part, they're gone. What it does have is indications of the central heating system, the hypocaust, which is that open area there supported by bricks. Hot air would flow through that and warm the floor. This area is a fish market, and it's only recently been excavated. And so this is fairly fresh. It's something that's still going on today in Salamis. And matter of fact, they found some Roman roads there that I'm going to be showing you in just a second that are brand new, that is just discovered last year. This, on the other hand, is something more mundane. It's a 44-seat latrine. This is the public latrine that would have been used during Roman times. Now, privacy is minimal in here, but apparently that wasn't of any particular importance. If you were really rich and you wanted to improve your position in life a little bit, you might have a slave sit on the marble and warm it up for you before you sat on it. Something else that's here is that there are an awful lot of water channels. Of course, there would be a lot of water necessary for the hot water baths and for the latrines. Now, every self-respecting Roman city, or Greek city for that matter, had a theater, and Salamis was no exception to that. As a matter of fact, it had both a Roman amphitheater and regular Greek theater. This is the Greek theater, and it holds roughly 15,000 people. This statue has been reinforced with iron, I think, and that iron is going to split that statue as the iron rusts. They used to make that mistake. I hope that they don't make it much longer. They should have used bronze or copper or something that wouldn't rust. Just beyond the theater, there's that fish market that I told you had just been excavated a couple of years ago. Look at the road that runs down the way between those pillars. If you extend that out, it heads off into the distance towards the harbor. And that's where the folks found the road. That's the Roman road last year. This road was almost certainly used by St. Paul. What you'll recall from your Sunday school lessons, of course, is that in Acts, Barnabas and St. Paul joined up for his first missionary work. What you may not recall, though, is that Barnabas is a boy from Cyprus. He used to own real estate on Cyprus, which he sold. In fact, he was from Salamis, and so that explains it. Their first objective was Salamis, then, on the island of Cyprus. From there, they walked along the southern coast until they got to Paphos. Now, a couple of things happened according to tradition, although you will not find this in the New Testament. At the city of Larnaca, for example, they ran into St. Lazarus.
We're in Larnaca, Cyprus. And behind me is the Church of St. Lazarus. You see, after Lazarus was resurrected, things apparently got hot for him in Bethany. And so as a result of that, he fled to Cyprus. And St. Paul and Barnabas made him the local bishop. He died the second time, of course, and he was buried here at this location. In the 9th century, they erected a church here. The original church dates back to the 9th century at least. And in about 900, the Byzantine emperor had him dug up and sent to Constantinople. He's in Marseille now. But the locals, of course, didn't want him to go, and they knew that the Byzantine emperor was going to take him away. And so the rumor is that they hid the body under the altar, and that the body is still there. Right behind me, there's a large salt pan that's just outside of Larnaca at the airport, or very close to the airport at least. And one day, when Lazarus was bishop of Cyprus, he passed by this way, and he was getting a little bit hungry and thirsty. And this area at that time was said to be a vineyard. And the lady that owned the vineyard was out picking grapes. And Lazarus saw her and her basket, and the basket had a cover on it, and he asked her if he could have something. And she said no. She said the basket, which in fact had her grapes in it, instead only had salt in it. And as a result of that, now this area has been cursed because Lazarus was refused food, and it's now just a big salt pan. There is something else about this area that's also very interesting, and it's right here, just off of the salt pan. I'm going to swing the camera around. Just behind me there's a mosque, and that mosque was built there for a particular reason. You see, back in the 600s, Cyprus was being subjected to a lot of raids by Arabs. And one of the Arab raiding groups happened to have the aunt of Muhammad. This is back in the 600s. And she must have been pretty old at the time, and in any case, she fell off her mount here at this location and died, and she's buried, and that's why they built that mosque at that location.
Well, back to St. Paul and Barnabas, making their trek over to Paphos. They passed through Kurion, according to tradition, and they dropped by that theater that I showed you earlier. And they heard a lot of noise in the theater, and so St. Paul thought, well, this would be a good time to go preach. So he and Barnabas went into the theater to see what they could do. They took a look, and they turned around stunned. Everyone in the theater was naked, and St. Paul, for one time in his life, could say nothing. We're moving on with St. Paul and Barnabas to the capital in Paphos, on the west side of the island. Incidentally, that bell ringing is for an actual church service. It's Sunday, and that's an Episcopal service being held in the church. This isn't just for tourists gawking at the inside. This church is where it is, and we are here because this is where St. Paul's Pillar is located. This is where St. Paul was said to have been scourged on Cyprus. Except he wasn't. The whole thing is really a story. Nevertheless, it's an important part of the tradition on Cyprus. According to the New Testament, St. Paul was beaten by the Jews many times and occasionally by Roman officials, but he was apparently never scourged. Scourged means to interrogate with lashes. It's a technical Roman term. And in Roman times, it was believed that no one was going to tell the truth unless they were tortured. Therefore, the scourging. There was a maximum of 39 lashes that could be given. After that, it was considered cruel and unusual punishment. After his experience in Cyprus, Paul did return to Jerusalem, and there he very nearly was scourged. As a matter of fact, there was a scuffle and trouble between him and the Jews, and a Roman centurion came out with some troops to try to find out what was going on, and he was going to scourge Paul in order to question him. However, as Paul was being bound, the centurion that was in charge of the small body of men leaned over, and Paul whispered to him, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" This caused him some concern. The centurion, who incidentally is the equivalent of an American major, lieutenant colonel, perhaps even a captain, reported to his tribune, who's the equivalent of an American colonel. You see, since the days of Caesar Augustus, it was illegal under the Lex Julia to either bind or beat a Roman citizen. So Paul's statement caused a little bit of concern. To wrongly claim Roman citizenship was a serious offense, so people wouldn't do it lightly. Certainly not Paul, but he might have had a small document with him called a diplomata, which would have been carried in a small pouch around his neck, and that could have proved Roman citizenship. We don't know if that was the case, however. In any event, Paul was believed, and the tribune comes back with the statement, "I had to pay a big price for my citizenship." He was referring to the bribes that he had to pay in order to get his citizenship. But Paul responded, "I was born a citizen." The tribune was concerned because he had already put Paul in chains. Incidentally, the tribune's name was Claudius Lycus, and that suggests that he had gotten his citizenship quite recently under the reign of Emperor Claudius, and he had taken that particular name as his own first name. The bottom line, of course, is that St. Paul is unlikely to have been scourged on Cyprus, or anywhere else for that matter. Despite the apocrypha that we've run into, something very important did happen to St. Paul and Barnabas at Paphos.
This is Paphos. Generally speaking, the place that we're at, generally called the House of Theseus because of the mosaics. This was usually the place of the Roman governor. Proconsul was the term that they used. Sergius Paulus was a proconsul of Rome. Remember that name. We'll come back to it.
But it's not the governor's palace that is the most splendid in town. No, the most splendid in town is the house of Dionysus, which is a little bit north of the house of Theseus, the governor's palace. It's at that location that the best mosaics on Cyprus are to be found. Certainly the most extensive. In these days, if you wanted to do a floor covering of some kind, you'd almost certainly do a mosaic. That is, you'd have little bits of stone cemented into the floor in a pattern. These patterns were universal throughout the empire. You could find them anywhere. Any of these patterns might find their opposite number in North Africa or Gaul or Great Britain or anywhere, because the same workman would have done the work. You see, any time there was a situation where lots of money was being made, these specialists would flood into that area and make sure that they were able to create all the mosaics that the local demand created. And the local demand created lots of them. They will go on floor after floor in the same house. Each picture has its own quality standard based on the size of the pebbles. The smaller the pebbles, the more of them you can get into a small space. And the result is a sharper picture. Here we're looking at some of the best megapixels of the period. Colored stones. No home is complete without them. Incidentally, Cicero was governor of Cyprus for a while. Actually, technically, he was proconsul. That's the term that the Romans would have used. And he just loved the job. It was really a cushy job, and he came home with lots of souvenirs. There was never any fighting on Cyprus. The Romans never had to post an army there. It was very quiet and tranquil, and everyone was reasonably happy and prosperous. When Lucius Sergius Paulus was proconsul of Cyprus under Claudius, that's the 1st century A.D., here in Paphos, Paul and Barnabas and John Mark came in contact with him. According to the book of Acts, when they got to Paphos, they found a certain magician, a Jewish false prophet whose name was Bar-Jesus, who was with the proconsul Sergius Paulus, a man of intelligence. This man summoned Barnabas and Saul, also known as Paul, and sought to hear the word of God. But Elymaeus, the magician, for that was the way his name was translated, was opposing them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. But Saul, who was also known as Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, fixed his gaze upon him, and said, "Now behold, the hand of the Lord is upon you, and you will be blind and not see the sun for some time." And immediately a mist and a darkness fell upon him, and he went about seeking those who could lead him by the hand. At this point, the proconsul saw the light, so to speak, and he became the first Christian convert that was coming out of the Roman ruling classes. So, is this story true? Now, the Roman writer, Pliny the Elder, does make reference to a Sergius Paulus, who he used as a source along with others in Book 2 and 18 of his work on natural history. And it's also interesting to note that Pliny mentions that the island of Cyprus was overrun with people who practiced sorcery, just like Elymaeus, who the Bible says was trying to deceive Sergius Paulus. Pliny writes, quote, "There exist different groups of magicians from the time of Moses, such as Jannes and Lotapi, of whom the Jews have spoken of, and in fact many thousands yearly follow after Zoroastrian ways, especially during recent times on the island of Cyprus." But of course that Sergius Paulus may not have been the proconsul that appears in the book of Acts. There was a boundary stone of Claudius mentioning Sergius discovered at Rome in 1887, and it records his appointment in AD 47 of the curators of the banks and the channel of the river Tiber. And in 1877, 10 years earlier, near Paphos, there was a memorial stone found indicating that Sergius Paulus was the proconsul at that time. In Paul's epistle to the Romans, he does not greet Sergius Paulus, and it is possible that Paulus had died before it was written.
We are at the tomb of St. Barnabas. Barnabas was a boy that was born in Salamis on Cyprus, and he owned real estate there. And he sold that real estate and he turned it over to the church. And then he joined up with St. Paul for his first missionary trip. And that first missionary trip was back to Cyprus, where they landed at Salamis, his hometown. Barnabas stayed pretty much on Cyprus, whereas St. Paul went on for other missionary travel. Barnabas was eventually martyred here. He was killed by the Jews, stoned to death, and he was buried here somewhere. Then, several hundred years later, someone had a dream. And in that dream, they dreamed where Barnabas was buried. And the emperor at Constantinople was very interested. He sent out a team to verify that, and they found a body. And that body had a moldy copy of St. Matthew in his hand. And as a result of that, they concluded that this was, in fact, his burial place. Now, of course, whether it was or not is open to some conjecture. This location was destroyed by the Arabs in the 600s during their raids. They eventually rebuilt this area.
You can go down in the crypt and visit St. Barnabas if you like. It's just a short walk down. Now let's take a closer look at that story that we just heard. You remember they validated the fact that this was St. Barnabas because he had a copy of St. Matthew in his hand. Well, there's a problem with that. You see, the Gospel of St. Matthew was not written until St. Barnabas had been martyred already. That leads us to the inescapable conclusion that St. Barnabas must have had an advanced copy.